Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Taparaskis with Microsoft and Xamarin University. Today we have a guest lecture by Andrew Strickland, who's going to talk to us about accessibility in mobile apps. This is something that I'm actually really interested in. I've been reading through a lot of the Microsoft accessibility guidelines recently because I do course authoring for Xamarin University. So there's lots of rules in the Microsoft guidelines for things like contrast ratios and sizes and so on. So this is really relevant actually to my work as well. So as we go through this, if you have questions, please ask in the chat window, and I'll kind of monitor the chat window. And when a question comes up, I'll interrupt Andrew at an appropriate time and get him to answer questions as we go along. So again, Andrew Strickland, and let's get going. Take it away, Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so a little bit about me. My name is Andrew Strickland, and I live in the Dallas, Texas area. And I work as a senior engineer at Olo on the mobile ordering team. So Olo, we do digital ordering for restaurants. We do lots and lots of restaurants, a lot of popular ones you might have known. It's a really cool place to work. We are hiring, by the way, always hiring, so everyone took a look. Go to olo.com, check it out. I've got many hobbies, so I had to pick two of them. So I picked racing cars and woodworking, some of my favorite things to do. And if you want to reach out to me or look at things I'm doing, at Guy Suru is my Twitter, and same thing for my GitHub. I'll probably talk about that later back at the end. So let's just dive right in because we got a lot of stuff to cover today. So first up is, what is accessibility? So the first definition you find on Google is the quality of being able to be reached or entered. And from the Web Accessibility Initiative, they kind of sum it up as enabling people with disabilities to participate equally. But what that really means to me is just bringing everyone to the table. So when you build an app, I think everyone should be able to use it, and if someone has a disability, that shouldn't stop them from using it. And so when we talk about disabilities, I just want to kind of always keep in people's mind that there's lots of different types and ranges of disabilities to kind of be aware of. Everything from visual disabilities to physical disabilities. So we have a hearing loss. So it's not just one type of disability. There is a range, and we have to, if we're going to tackle accessibility, we have to tackle it for everyone. Another term that comes up a lot with accessibility is ADA. So I want to talk real quick about what is ADA. So ADA stands for Americans with Disabilities Act here in the United States. And it was a law that was passed back in the 90s. And then they have the ADAA, which is passed in 2008, which kind of just defines the rules and the laws a little bit more. But it breaks down into like 3 different titles. So like Title I is if you're an employer and you have employees, you worry about making sure that they have accessibility, arrangements in place for them. The Title II is for government entities. So if you're working for a government entity or state or federal, these kind of give you the guidelines for accessibility for that. And then the third one is for any place that has like a public area or public business. So that kind of covers pretty much everything. So it doesn't matter really what you're working towards. A lot of things will be pulled into ADA. And ADA, part of it is like, do you have wheelchair ramps or elevators or things like that? But the other aspect is software. It is covered in that, under that as well. So why do we worry about accessibility? Well, there's kind of 2 main reasons. The first one is the legal side of ADA. So if you don't meet the accessibility requirements for ADA, then you can have a legal suit brought against you, and those can be very, very costly and have a lot of big side effects. So there's that, preventative side of ADA. But the nicer side is, inclusive side of ADA. So I want everyone to be able to use it. I don't want to leave any possible customers out. And so those are kind of the 2 main reasons why I want to, but sometimes those aren't enough. I think there's also a hidden topic, and I don't include it in here because I don't like the fact that it exists, but one of those is the competitive advantage. Not everyone tackles accessibility, and if you're trying to sell like an application in an enterprise environment or something like that, having an accessible application is an advantage to you, because you can say we have accessibility and we can help you meet your accessibility requirements So that's something to always keep in mind when you're talking to your project managers or whoever handles that, because accessibility and tackling accessibility takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources. So it's not just an easy quick fix. It can take a lot of time. So what are our next steps? So there's kind of like two sides to the accessibility. One is knowing the requirements. So what does it take, what makes up an accessible app? And it can be a little puzzling. That's why the monkey looks like that. And then how do you build your apps for accessibility? And that's my grumpy face, because one of the things that I've learned through my process at Olo as we were doing accessibility is that it can be not the easiest thing to learn and find out. Once you get going, it's okay, but it can take some ramp up. So hopefully I'm going to address both of these things and hopefully give everyone a jump start to their accessibility. So when it comes to learning about accessibility, you have what I call the Accessibility Bible, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I like to call it CAG for short. I can't really figure out how to get the W in there, but I call it CAG. And these were developed by the W3, and they apply to everything accessibility from a web standpoint. So if you're doing web development, things like that, the CAG defines everything you need to be addressing in order to kind of be accessible. Now, when it comes to mobile, there's a draft called the Mobile Accessibility WCAG draft, and that one is to kind of break down the CAG and say this is how it applies to mobile. It's a little old, and it's not the most thorough, so it kind of leaves you in a little bit of an ambiguous land when it comes to accessibility. And also, one thing when you're talking about accessibility is there's different levels of accessibility. So you may hear things like I'm A or AA or AAA accessible. And what those means are just varying levels of accessibility to what degree of accessibility. So like a level 1, it has just a few things accessible, whereas a level 3 has everything really accessible. So you may strip out a lot of colors and make things really, really big. So I think most people, and even some recent government recommendations for the government entities, are aiming for a AA accessibility requirement. So, and another thing I just want to throw out here is as you're learning about how to make an app accessible, there's a lot of things to consider. And so if you haven't done it before and your company is starting out, I'm going to recommend you seek out like some third-party assessment, some third-party help. There's plenty of companies that you can give them a copy of your app, and they'll go through and test it and try and help you find where you might be failing to meet your criteria. It's definitely a learning experience in that, and you may not catch everything because accessibility is not something that most developers deal with every day. So I'm going to take a quick break here and show you some of the websites. So this is what I call the CAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from W3, and there's tons of information here. They have And especially if you're a web developer, you'll find tons of things here, but even just in general about testing techniques and understanding and how things work, upcoming developments that are coming. So this is if you're accessibility, this is kind of your standard to go to. And under that, you'll find this, which is the Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is a recommended read. It is not the most easy read, but this will give you, this is where we have all the information about what makes an app accessible. And then the final part of that is the mobile accessibility, how the CAG 2.0 and other guidelines apply to mobile. So this is our working draft, and this is a must read if you're going to be doing mobile accessibility, because this tells you in detail all the different items and things to think about to make your app accessible. And in each one, they kind of go into details, and they can help you figure out, you know, this is a level A accessibility, this is a level AA, this is a AAA, and what are the success criteria. So this is kind of gives you the big arching overview of everything. And when you go to, like, if you have a third-party company look at it, they should give you, you know, hey, you failed this criteria on these screens or these controls type of thing. So those are some quick, the websites that we use as reference material. Oh no, wrong button, but we'll jump back there. So some quick accessibility checks for you. So these are just some things that I've learned of things that you can just look into your app to see, are you meeting requirements. So you want to check out your navigation from an accessibility user standpoint. Can people navigate to all the different controls and screens properly and with ease? Color is a really big one. We care about contrast ratios. And so there's actually the calculations online, and there's lots of tools you'll find online to check your colors. But if you have text and a background, you have to maintain certain contrast ratios between those for people who have color blind issues and things like that, and low vision. So that's another requirement. It's not as always easy to meet. Things such as changing and setting focus. So if you have like a screen load or a loading screen, making sure that when things finish that an item gets focused on the screen is a big thing for users. Letting users know that a control on the screen is interactive. So this is a button, this is a switch, letting the users know what they're looking at. That's for visual impairment. And then another issue to kind of think about is display time on the screen. So a lot of the things we talk about is for visual impairments, and so if I show something on the screen, a screen reader needs enough time to read it. So if you use like the really old school Android, quick pop-ups that disappear, or you write your own custom pop-up messages that just show up for a little bit and then disappear, those may not work for accessibility, and so you may have to change those to where the users can dismiss them, or if you detect if there's a screen reader being used, and then show a different type of pop-up so that they're able to be read properly. Another thing about quick accessibility is your gestures. And one thing you'll see later on when we get into the tools is that gestures completely change when you start using screen readers on your mobile phone. And so if you have a lot of really fancy gestures in your application, those might not be easily discovered or as used as well. So you may want to rethink how you implement non-standard gestures into your app. And kind of my last little thing is kind of like eliminating the cool. And what I mean by that is a lot of times as developers, we may have a designer come up with a really cool design, and then we just hack and slash away a lot to make something really cool, but that cool feature may not work well with a screen reader, may not work well with a keyboard or a Braille reader. And so, it's one of those things like it's cool, but it's not standard, you may have a really hard time with accessibility on it. So if you can keep your cool features down a little bit and try and keep things more subdued, that's kind of my little quick tip on that. The other thing about this is that, this is my legal warning for myself. Like if you just do these things, it doesn't guarantee that you're ADA compliant. ADA compliance is a really tough thing. So I'm not saying do this and you're ADA compliant. It's a legal warning there. So it's tricky. So that's why I always recommend, getting someone else that has knowledge. Can look at your app and test it to make sure you're accessible, meet those ADA requirements. So next I kind of want to dive into the development side of things. So if you're a developer and you're developing accessibility for your apps, the first thing you want to do is you want to read the documentation you have. Now sadly there's not a lot there, and I'll jump out real quick and show you some of it. So one of the first things is on the Xamarin website still. They have their accessibility on iOS topic, which kind of goes through and gives you a quick overview of your accessibility UIs. They have a similar thing on Android. These are mostly up to date. There's some things that are missing, but it's because Android is a little more of a moving target when it comes to accessibility. But those are going to be your two main sources. There is the native Apple accessibility and native Android accessibility stuff, but there's not a lot there. And I think the other thing that you'll notice is if you start running into issues and searching on the web, you're not going to find a lot of information. There's just not a lot of Stack Overflow questions or forum questions, and I think it's just because most developers, at least I didn't before I started this project, we don't think about accessibility. And so because of that, there's just not a lot of material out there. And so, as y'all start to attend and do your accessibility, I really recommend voice everything openly, post in forums, and hopefully we can start building up that knowledge base for developers as they start to come into it. And so also when you start talking about doing your development, you're going to have two tools that you're going to use for your accessibility testing. You're going to use VoiceOver, which is the screen reader for iOS, and TalkBack, which is for Android. Now there are other accessibilities, like I said earlier. So if you're doing, you want to test your apps with keyboard, make sure they work with keyboards. If you have audio components, you want to make sure that you have a video that goes with that, or some kind of UI that goes with the audio. But for most people, they're going to work more on the reader side of things. So you have VoiceOver for iOS and TalkBack for Android. And I'm going to show you and demo that in a little second how you can enable those and how those work to a little bit. But the other part of this is if you're going to do your development, you need to really use real devices. And so what we found is that you can try and use the simulator on iOS, but it doesn't really say stuff, and it can be misleading. So you think something works, but it doesn't actually. And then same thing testing on Android. The emulators don't have TalkBack enabled, so you have to side load it. So you can try and use that, but I just recommend go ahead and using a real device with your accessibility, because you want to be able to see how the gestures feel and everything. So if you're going to tackle accessibility, you really need to use real devices for your accessibility testing. And the other thing that I want to talk about is making accessibility your first-class citizen. So if you're going to tackle it, you can't really just tack it on at the end. It needs to be first class. So what I mean by that is when you're going through your UI, maybe your designers, you're coming up with a new screen, before you finish the design of that screen, go through and assess it from an accessibility standpoint. Does this work well with accessibility? Does things flow well? Can things be found? And then in your development, make sure if you spend time for your unit test, you spend time to build automated UI test, spend time to develop your accessibility and make sure it works and do accessibility testing. And same thing, with your QA engineers, make sure they're testing for accessibility when they go through and do things. It will make your life, it will take a lot of time, but it will make your life go a lot smoother than trying to go back and retrofit stuff. And so I've got a couple of tips and tricks for you that I've learned as I've been going through development. And so our first development tip and trick is choose your frameworks and plugins carefully. And I love this picture because this is exactly how we ship software, right? DVDs and boxes. But what I mean by this is when you start relying, and in Xamarin, in my world, we always use a lot of third-party plugins, whether it's a loading screen, maybe you want a third-party plug-in for the camera that lets you do some kind of cool thing with the camera. But just because it's easy to add doesn't mean that that developer took the time to make sure it was accessible or that it worked in an accessible way. And I've actually seen this with a number of things that I've tried to use where it works great, but then when you add on accessibility, it does something you totally wouldn't expect. And maybe it's open source and maybe you can do a pull request and fix it, maybe not. But it is something to consider if you're wanting to tackle accessibility, as your frameworks and plugins may not work with it. And that also includes, I have to say, Xamarin.Forms at the moment. I know it's something that's being worked on right now, and they're making improvements in that category, but it is still a little on the weak side, Xamarin.Forms. So if accessibility is really important to you, keep an eye on how that develops. But I say go in with caution on that. But yeah, it's not an easy thing to tackle, and when you have no control over the source code, it can get a lot harder. My other tip, number 2, is timing is everything, and watch your breakpoints. So I've had a lot of similar experiences. I have this frustration of this cat where I'm trying to debug something, and I'm okay, this should say this, and then it doesn't. And the reason is because when you're doing screen reader work, timing on the UI thread is very, very important. And you can't just pause it and expect it to read it. It doesn't really work that way. So if you're wanting to say, hey, is it actually working? If you have a breakpoint in there, it won't work. Also timing, and just in general, like if I have trying to say multiple things in a row, timing everything so that it all gets read can also be tricky. And we'll see this in a demo here in a little bit as well. And then my third one, trying to keep the KISS simple, the KISS principle is use simple controls and use simple UIs. So to make your life easier for accessibility, use the controls as they were meant to be used. So if you need a button there, use a button. If you try to use some other control and make it act like a button, you'll find that it doesn't work well with accessibility. So if you use the controls as they're meant to be used, you'll find that voiceover and talkback work the way they should. And so when you start doing a lot of custom controls or kind of doing weird things, it's not going to work. An example, sometimes even just using the normal control doesn't work out the way that you may want to. An example of that would be the seek bar on Android. That has to be one of the worst accessibility controls I've ever seen. It just doesn't work. It says everything in percentage. You just don't really have really good control over that. Another example would be radio groups and segmented UI buttons. A lot of times people want to write their own radio group or multiple select control, as I would call them. But then your accessibility is going to be really out of whack. So using the built-in radio groups and segmented UI controls may change your design, but your accessibility will work a lot better.
Andrew, you got a question.
Yeah.
Accessibility, this is on navigation. So accessibility means navigation, right, as part of it. So the question is, I'd like you to explain a little bit more about the navigation aspect.
Yeah, so part of it, there's a couple different ways when you're talking about navigation. So one aspect is can I navigate to a screen easily, and can I navigate back? So an example is you may navigate to a screen that has an issue, but then the user can't get the button to go back to the screen. And so maybe a normal user can, but the back button's not there. So things that can control the flow of navigation is an issue. The other thing is, an example is a lot of people have this framework architecture, I guess I don't know what you want to say, of when I go from one screen to another screen, usually I click a button or touch a button, and then I'm going to go to the next screen, I'm going to throw up a loading screen, I'm going to load all my data, and then display my data. So the issues with that is, you go to the next screen, it needs to say you're on the next screen, and then you have to worry about the loading indicator, and then changing the focus and the loading indicator goes through. It can be a lot of work, and you'll run into a lot of issues. So one of the things I like to do is, if you touch a button on a screen, I throw the loading screen up on that screen, do all my loading of data, then go to the next screen and just show the data. And so by doing that, you kind of don't interrupt the flow of the screen reader when you navigate. Because one of the items under the CAG is when you navigate to a screen, your focus needs to be on the first item of the screen or at the top. And so making sure that happens every time you navigate can be tricky depending on what you do when you navigate. So that's an area where I've seen some issues before.
Cool. I know we actually have one more question. So this is back to Xamarin.Forms. And
yes.
So in Xamarin.Forms, it says using a slider, right? The keyboard users on Windows are fine. Like I assume that means like you could use arrow keys or whatever. However, on Android and iOS, doesn't seem possible to focus on the slider with a keyboard. So is there any workaround that you know of, or other than just giving up on the slider and replacing it with like an up and a down button?
Yeah, I mean, sliders kind of go into that whole seek bar area, and sliders are one of the controls that don't have good accessibility, even when you're not doing Xamarin.Forms. And so it's a tricky one. Like I've spent a lot of time writing custom accessibility handling around sliders. So I don't think in Xamarin.Forms, I mean, you could do a custom renderer and try and then you have to really dive deep in the custom renderer to get into the deep accessibility controls to make it work the way you want. But my recommendation is, unless it's absolutely a requirement, try to avoid sliders and use another type of control. Or you could do a situation where you try and detect screen readers and then use different controls. So if the screen reader's off, then you can use your slider, but if they have a screen reader, you switch it out to some buttons. I mean, it's a little bit more work, so it just kind of depends on what you're wanting to do. But yeah, because the sliding bars is a seek bar on Android, and it's a UI slider on the iOS side, but yeah, they're not easy controls to work with from an accessibility standpoint. Yes, that's just the sad reality today. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Cool. We actually got several more questions. Let's do a couple more questions, and then we have 3 queued up. Let's do these 3, and then we'll move forward.
Okay, that sounds good.
First question is: suppose you're building a mobile app which captures a picture, like for example, of a building, and then you want to let the user augment the picture, like edit, add stuff to it, like a 3D image maybe you're building. So what accessibility options would you recommend for an app like that, and what considerations might come up?
That's a really tough one. So, the cameras do technically work from an accessibility standpoint. The controls are highlighted and they're accessible. But that's even a deeper aspect. The most stuff I've dealt with the camera is that it doesn't work when I try to use it. For example, a lot of people may have used Card.io before. I've heard of Card.io. It's by PayPal, and there's a nice little Xamarin plugin for it to capture credit cards using the camera, and that one is not accessibility compliant. When you go to that screen, it has no accessible controls on it. So from that perspective, we actually silo that part of our app away from it. So I can say, well, this feature is not going to work for accessibility, and at least not right now. And so as a temporary thing, we're like, do we just hide it? But in terms of how you actually make it work, that's a challenging one. But you have to go through all the different controls and components of your camera screen and make sure they work on it. Yeah, so that's the thing. Sometimes an app and what you do with the app doesn't work well from accessibility, so you have to kind of keep that in mind as well.
Cool. All right, so these next 2 questions are related. So first, basically they're both asking about either third-party or Xamarin controls, plugins, frameworks that help put accessible controls in your app sort of out of the box. So specifically, the first one is just general plugin or frameworks to make apps or controls more accessible with less work on your part, I guess. I sort of think like if you go over to some third-party control vendor, right? Will you have a better experience, or any of them that are better than others?
I haven't tested, so I know there's a lot of control companies, and I haven't tested any of those controls for accessibility. I don't use those. Mm-hmm. But that's one thing to test. I don't know of any that are better, so you have to look at the ones you use, and they have to be a test by test, or contact the company and say, hey, have you worked on accessibility for these controls, and does it exist or not? And especially in those cases, because you don't have control over it, so if that's an important part, you may be like, okay, well, I can't do accessibility on these screens, so you may have to build your own or work with that vendor to get them to get their apps to be accessible. If it's an open source plugin, like we've actually done that, we've taken some plugins that we've worked on, and we've submitted pull requests to help with accessibility on those and got the developers to pull those in. So if it's open source, you have maybe a little more luck with getting it to work, but I don't have any, these are the ones that make life easy. The easiest way to make your apps accessible is like on this screen we're looking at, is just use the simple controls, use the basic controls, because those work out of the box with accessibility for the most part. So
Cool. So the more specific question is about do you know of any controls for augmented or virtual reality, either by Xamarin or others? That's something that's coming still?
Maybe. I haven't heard of anything, at least from an accessibility standpoint. And I guess one thing that kind of does bring up, and some people may not miss, is accessibility doesn't mean that I'm building an app for someone with a disability, trying to help them see in the world or navigate. Really what it means is I have an app, say it's a banking app or a food ordering app, and I'm just making sure that that person can use it that has a disablement. So that's really what the heart of accessibility is. I mean, there is that level of trying to build, software and tools to help people do other things in their life, but I think the first part is just like I have a food ordering app. I want to make sure that someone that can't see can order their hamburger, right? That's kind of the first kind of way that we approach accessibility when it comes to.
Right. Okay. Actually, we have a lot more questions, so let's just keep going for a couple more minutes. I like to handle these as they come up if we can. Obviously, we don't want to spend the entire time here because you won't get through the rest of your stuff. But some of these look pretty quick, so let's keep going here. So the next
Okay.
one is for colorblind users. Right.
Yes.
Can you apply different textures to backgrounds to help distinguish between colors? There's any research or guidance about what textures are best in a situation like that?
Yeah, and so there is some guidance. I don't have a specific, but they're in the CAG. If you read through about color blindness, so there's kind of two aspects. So there's color blindness, and so you have certain colors you don't want to mix and match, right? And then the other aspect is contrast ratio. So if someone has vision issues, and you have a bright background with a bright text, they're not going to be able to see that.
Right, the magic 4.5 to 1.
Yeah. So that number is specifically for AA. So remember we talked about the levels. So if you were just going to be, well, I'm going to be just A-rated accessibility, then you might have a lower contrast ratio. Whereas if you wanted to go AAA, which is like hardcore accessibility, that's like a 2 to 1 ratio. So depending on that where you go, but the level 2 is at 1.4. Yeah, that's the magic number to hit.
Excellent.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah.
Okay. Next is using a list view. Do you have any? It's a common thing, right? Master detail kind of setup. So you have a list view. What controls do you recommend in that scenario?
Use the ones that are built in. Use collection views and table views, list views, recycler views. Those work and they're handled properly in your apps. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with using the normal built-in controls. Now, if you start doing a lot of crazy stuff in your cells, that's where you might run into some accessibility issues. Just making sure all the functionality you throw into a cell happens. But in terms of just the list views themselves, there's no problem using the defaults. I just say, try to avoid throwing too much information and too much functionality into each cell.
And it's okay to include things like long press on a cell, for example, or the the iOS slide to expose other functionality.
You can try that. I think that's one of the points I pointed out earlier, gestures. So, and one thing you might see is when you turn on VoiceOver and you turn on TalkBack, all of the gestures for the phone change completely. So there's no more, tap is now select, and double tap is what single tap used to be, right? So if you had double tap functionality, that's not the same. I'm not sure if it's triple tap, but so things change. If it's a default gesture, if it's a built-in gesture, then it's probably safe to include. If you're adding some kind of new gesture functionality, it may not work, it may not be found. So you may need an alternative way to access something. An example, kind of master detail, you're talking about navigation. Sometimes you click a hamburger menu and you slide a hamburger menu out. Well, maybe your default to closing it is to swipe back to the left. Well, that doesn't work with accessibility. So you actually need to add a physical close button on your hamburger menu to get it to close properly. So the users know this is how I close the hamburger menu.
Cool. Okay, and so we have these next two questions, or last two, and then we'll move on. These are very similar, actually. So they're asking about accessibility versus usability. And aren't those two things kind of related? So if your app is usable, easy to use for all users, won't that help with accessibility as well? So accessibility versus usability, I guess, is the core idea here.
Yeah, and that's very true. And I think one of the things that I found is when I started addressing the accessibility items in my app, it pointed out some flaws in my user experiences and how I just kind of made assumptions on how people would see and interact with my app. And so, and then I'm like, well, if I address this, it's going to make the normal user's life easier, but also make it better. So I do think it goes hand in hand. It helps you reevaluate your app and your user experience and how you flow. It doesn't necessarily just making your app make your accessibility standards doesn't necessarily make your app better for everyone, but it can, and I think it definitely does point out those like areas where you need improvement for sure.
Excellent. So thank you. Let's move on, and we'll do another round of questions in a bit.
Sure. Yeah. So the next thing is you got to pray to the demo guys, but we're going to try and do a code demo here. So let's see here. So I have an app, and this is a very simple app. It is a tip calculator app. So actually, before I do this, I'm going to show you the tools a little bit. So get my AirPlay going. Okay. So so to get your VoiceOver working on your phone, so real quick, you go to your settings and you go to general, and then you have accessibility, and you tap accessibility, and then there's the VoiceOver. When you tap VoiceOver, you can tap it and turn it on.
Settings, accessibility, back button.
And that's maybe some people's first time to hear that, but your phone gets very chatty when you turn this on. And so
accessibility, general, back button.
And so if I want to,
back button.
I can tap and it reads stuff. I can scroll.
22 of 31.
Lots of different things. I'm going to turn it off.
VoiceOver off.
Real quick, but that's how you turn it on. And then the other thing I want to show is under the accessibility tab for the development, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there is accessibility shortcut. And if you click on that, you can set it. And so basically when you triple tap your home button, it will do one of these things for you. And so for me, it's turning VoiceOver on and off, because sometimes I don't want to go through my whole app in VoiceOver. I just want to get to the screen in the app and then turn VoiceOver on, or the screen before and turn it on and then navigate to my screen. So being able to use the triple home button for accessibility is shortcut is super helpful on iOS. It will increase your time, because what I've found is just testing and going through accessibility is a slower process than normal, just because we're not used to it and interacting with the phone is a little different. So that's how you turn accessibility on and off. So I wanted to show you the code. So this is a very simple tip calculator app. So nothing fancy here. We're going to get it to build and load. But you just put in your amounts, put in your tip amount or tip percentage, and it calculates your tip for you. I did too much shaking apparently. It takes a little bit to deploy. Come on, come on, come on. Okay. There we go. So this is my tip calculator app. You can enter your amount. So you can say 46 and 12 and tap figure and hit done and say figure out my tip. And that's not working. Did I close something out? I may have, but yeah. So this is my figure out tip button. So one thing I want to show you, I'm going to close it out, and I'm just going to open it in accessibility mode.
VoiceOver on. Xamarin demo. Xamarin demo.
And so I had a little issue there. So we have tip calculator.
Total. Tip calculator. Bill amount. Text field.
And so this says bill amount text field. I can double tap.
Text field. Is that 3?
And y'all can't see that. Let me know if I'm not showing my screen, Mark. And then 35. And I can swipe and go to click on done. Double tap.
Done. Tip calculator.
Well, see, that just threw me back up to the top. That's not a very good user experience.
35. Text field.
35 doesn't tell me anything.
10%.
It reads 10% this time.
Double tap to add text field. Is that 2?
And let's say they did a good job.
1.
So
1. 0. Done.
And so
calculator.
now it just threw me back up to the top. That's also not a very good experience.
35. Text field. 10. Text field.
So those things don't give me a lot of information now. So I want to say figure out my tip,
Total.
and it totally skips it. I can't select figure out tip, but total works. So I want to kind of dive into why.
Face portrait.
this happened a little bit. So one of the things I did, and I did this on purpose because some people may have done this in the past, is instead of using a button for my find tip button, instead, and this may not want to connect to the Mac, there we go. Instead, I used a image view. And it's not going to show me the image view, but it's just a simple image view. So a couple of things, and so I kind of have some tips on here on how I can make this a better user experience. So the one is whenever I finish entering my bill amount on this text field, I'm going to say, tell the next field to become first responder, which is a good thing. That's just a good user experience anyways. You want to go ahead and move to the next field. The next one, though, is should return is when I finish. I don't want to go back up to the next UI piece. So instead, I'm going to use this API, which is a UI accessibility API, and I'm going to tell it that there was a layout change and find tip button. And what that's going to do is when the keyboard closes, it's going to tell the screen reader to go to the find tip button and give it an accessibility focus. Another thing that I want to do, because this is an image view, it's not a button, so remember I prefer to use a button and it would take care of this, but since I didn't, I'm going to do a couple things. So first thing is there's an API that says is accessibility element, and I got to set that to true, because by default the image view is not accessibility. I can also set this in the storyboard, but I am choosing to set this in code. The other thing that I can do is say as I can give it an accessibility label. So since this is an image, it doesn't actually say anything, it doesn't read it, it would just say image or image view. So I need to add an accessibility label, so when I give it focus on accessibility, it will say figure out tip, which is the button that I put, which is the text that I had on the image. And then the last thing I do on iOS side, they have things called accessibility traits, and these kind of define what type of actions and interactions should happen with the screen reader. And so in this case, this is a button, and so one of these options here, right, you see there's lots of different traits that you can do. I'm going to say this is a button. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a test. Oh, that's why it didn't work. Sorry, I took that out. That shouldn't have been there. But tap gesture recognizer. So I'm going to see if I can run this real quick. I'm going to go ahead and connect my Android device while I'm waiting. Maybe. It didn't like that. May need to plug that back in. And I'm just waiting on my iOS to deploy. Okay, so now my iOS deployed, so a couple things I can do.
VoiceOver on. SamUni. Demo. iOS. Tip calculator. Bill amount. Text field.
So I'm going to my bill amount.
Text field. 2. 5. Done. Text field. Is empty. 10%. Character mode. Insertion 1.
So this is a better experience already.
2. Done. Figure out tip. Button.
So now it just selected figure out tip button, and because I added that button, it added that button for me automatically. You don't want to just say button at the end of it. You want the readability, that reader to read it from the accessibility trait. And so when I double tap this,
figure out tip.
So it reread the name of the button, but that actually is not working for my accessibility standards because something actually changed on the screen. My total came out to 28 down below, but the user doesn't know that. So if the user taps something, you need to notify that user that something changed on the screen or that something happened. Something that can get really tricky is dealing with states.
Landscape. Fake portrait. VoiceOver off.
And so the thing that I do here, and this is kind of where I said timing is everything, this is where that comes into play, is I actually am going to do an await task. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do an await, and this is going to give it time for it to say the figure out tip button. It happens automatically. And then I'm going to use a user accessibility post notification. This is just a general announcement. And I can say tip calculated, or you could say tip amount was. You can do different things here. But this will, after I tap it, the tip button, it will tell the user that the tip was calculated. You could also do a layout change and navigate to that control. It's kind of like is that a good user experience or not? But you do need to do something to let the user know something happened, something changed on the screen. So at a minimum, just giving that user the notification. If I don't have this wait task delay, this doesn't get read, because what happens is the tab gesture recognizer event closes, and then accessibility automatically takes over and will just say figure out tip. So you really have to wait till after the gesture recognizer finishes, it reads that out, and then reads your notification. It's kind of it's just a way of life that I've come to find. And the thing is again, what I talked earlier about, it may not work with some things. This is an example of why you want to do that. Why you don't want to use a simulator, because the simulator would tell you that it read that out, but in real life it wouldn't. So that's kind of like some quick things to make this a better experience. One thing that I'm not going to take the time to do, but it needs to happen, is we need, yeah, there we go. We actually need labels. So bill amount and tip percent are just hints, but that doesn't meet our accessibility requirements. We actually need to have a hard label to the left or to the right of it that says bill amount and tip percent. That way the user can figure out that, hey, this field right here that says 10 is actually tip. So we need what they call associated labels. You can also, other ways you can get around it if you're creative, but the most basic one is to add a label for each input field to make your accessibility requirements. So we're running short on time, so I'm going to jump on over to my Android. So Android, I built the same thing, and let's see if Visor is going to work this time. There we go. So, so on Android, if you go to your settings and you go to accessibility, first thing you see is TalkBack. I'm going to get my little ad. That's okay. So TalkBack, and you just tap on it, and you can turn TalkBack on and off. So a couple things on TalkBack, some settings you want to work with. If you click on the settings at the top, there's a couple things that you want to work on. So one thing is you want to TalkBack to suspend and resume using the shortcut keys. So that we see if you push the volume up and down at the same time, it will suspend or turn off the TalkBack. The other feature I like to turn on or change is the resume from suspend, and I change this from notification only. Otherwise, every time my screen comes back, it turns TalkBack on. So now the only way for me to turn it on is to swipe down and tap my TalkBack is suspended. And it turns the TalkBack back on. TalkBack suspended. So another thing that you can do, which is nice on Android, is you can actually say display speech output. So rather than having to listen to everything it says, if you flip that switch, it will show everything that it's currently saying on the screen as a caption on the bottom. So rather than having it be as chatty towards you, you can use that as a feature as well. That's how you turn TalkBack on and off. And so for me, I just leave TalkBack on all the time, and then I just resume it when I want to do it. So on our Android side, we have, and I can show you this layout file. So you can see it's a very similar thing. We have bill amount, tip percentage, figure out tip, and total. And so if I run this one, I'm going to turn.
Bill amount, edit box. Showing number 2, 2, 5, 5. Next. Showing number keyboard. 1, 1, 2, 2. Done. Number keyboard hidden. Unlabeled button.
So it said
Tap to activate.
Unlabeled button, so that's not very good. But it did go to it. So this is a step that was a little bit better than the iOS side. It read those out on the first one, didn't read on the second one, and the figure out tip didn't work. So the quick way to remedy this is I need to set my content description, because this is a content button, so set a content description on that. And then on Android, I can say announce for accessibility, and that will announce that the calculated total happened. So with those things, and I can run it one more time to show you what's going to happen now with this.
Xamarin demo Android bill amount edit box showing number key 1 5 back button tick percentage edit box showing number keyboard 3
No, that's
delete 3 delete 8 done number keyboard hidden figure out tip button.
so it says figure out. So now it says figure out tip button.
Total calculated.
And when I double tap it, it says total calculated when it shows that. So that's a little bit better user experience. I need the same thing. I need my labels on here for my screen. Same thing as I needed on iOS. But on Android, there's a little bit different feature, and you can see this in all the documentation. You can actually say, you know, this is a label for. There's a label for feature, and then you can set it for an ID. And so when the content reader reads your label, it will say, you know, bill amount label for edit, bill amount edit text, right? And so it kind of draws an association between your labels, which is a nice feature of Android that you don't have in iOS. But yeah, that's kind of, and you know, this one had a little bit less work on it than the other one. And that's because I used an image button. If I'd used a button on the other one, I wouldn't have to use this much. But yeah, there's similar APIs. Android does have some things where you can actually build accessibility delegates, or you can dive into exactly how the reader handles everything and processes stuff. But yeah, so that's kind of my quick little demo on the voiceover tools and just some ways I kind of go about working on making these better. So
now would be a good time to jump back into questions. We have several.
Yeah.
queued up.
Cool. Yeah, I'm done.
So here's a nice general question. Are there standard ways of detecting whether or not you have a physical keyboard attached to the app, whether there's a screen reader active, and so on?
There are ways to determine if a screen reader is active or not. I'm not sure about the keyboard. I think there is a way on Android. I'm not sure on iOS. The keyboard's no different than if you're just a normal keyboard. But the screen reader, yes, there is a way to determine if a screen reader is active.
So basically iOS, Android, they all have APIs that let you...
The APIs, you can say, is the screen reader on and active if you wanted to do something differently, yeah.
Cool. All right, here's a real specific question about something, I don't know if you've heard of this, called the Wikitude SDK. Is this good for usability for augmented reality, or is there other options you can recommend?
I'm not familiar with that one. I'm sorry. I'd have to look into that.
Okay, cool. Thanks. A couple more. Do Xamarin.Forms tap gesture recognizers take into account double tapping required for screen reader support? So the first tap reads the control, second tap fires the gesture.
Yeah, so basically in my understanding of what happens is when I have my screen reader on and I single tap to select it, and then I double tap, it passes that through as a single tap to your screen gesture recognizers. So, for example, in my code on my iOS side, I just have a tap gesture recognizer here. So it will pass that through as a single. So your double tap that the reader does come across as a single tap here. That doesn't mean that it's going to handle everything for accessibility, but it should go through. From that perspective, yeah. You don't have to do anything special to handle the different gestures for accessibility.
Cool. Another one. On iOS, by default, the speech reads passwords as they're being typed into a secure entry. Is there a preferred alternative? So, for example, vision impaired users can use a logon page, but without having their password read aloud.
Not really, because I mean, if you're thinking about it from an accessibility standpoint, they don't know what their password is unless they're, manually tap. I mean, like I can't know that. I can't read it. So I mean, if you just use the secure stuff, that's the accessibility standard there, and I would not alter that. So if it's reading it when you set that to secure, let it read it, because that's how the user knows. Because theoretically, the user can't see the screen, or they can't see white characters. They have to have some kind of feedback mechanism. So yeah, I wouldn't try and alter that. I would leave that as is.
So tell them to just wear headphones.
Yeah. So most people don't have open. Most people who are going to use that, they're going to use headphones. If they're working on their phone, because the phone can get very, very, very chatty.
Right.
Matter of fact, I had a situation where I was working with someone and they were showing me an accessibility thing, and then they got a text message, and it read that text message, and so that text message sounded kind of weird. So I mean, if you're just using a normal phone and you're showing people, like everything that happens on that phone is exposed. So just you can be cautious with that a little bit too.
Great. We have one more, and this is funny, is because this is exactly the question I was about to ask you, because I just did this week, and now I'm questioning whether or not this is a good idea. So I had some text, and then I wanted like it was basically like an about page, where it said this app, the code in this app is licensed using the MIT license or something, and I wanted like MIT license to be tappable and take me to the definition of my license, and I wanted to look really nice as just like a nice paragraph. So I used a label for the link and put a tap gesture recognizer on it, and it looks really cool. But now I'm wondering if that was a good idea. And so that's the same question here. Can I put a label instead of a button? Is that good or bad practice?
Well, the issue there is, will the user know if it's interactive or not? So you could use a label, you can use whatever control you want, but if I select it, does it just read MIT license, or does it say MIT license double tap to activate, or MIT license button, right? So the end user will need to know. So something where if it's a label, you could add the UI trait on iOS of button, and then it would automatically say MIT label or MIT license button, and they would know that they could double tap in and interact with it. But I mean, also when you're talking about web views and things like that, like there's a break in between reading the rest of the text and then when you hit your interactive element and then when you move on to the rest of the text. So there's a literal stop where it's going to quick stop reading, they're going to swipe to the next element, it's going to read the MIT button, and then swipe to the next thing. So from a visual user perspective, it may look like one nice big paragraph with a touchable link, but from an interactive user, from another person's perspective, visual impaired user, it's going to be a different experience. So.
Right, and then so a follow-up to that is, what about focus? Like, Xamarin, I actually don't know the answer to this question. Xamarin.Forms label, can they receive focus or not? And is that sort of an issue?
Things can receive focus on Xamarin.Forms. That's the question of like, does the APIs exist for that yet or not? I mean, yes, a label can get focus from an accessibility standpoint, not from a normal OS standpoint, but from an accessibility standpoint, they can. But can you do it in Xamarin.Forms? That's a maybe if the APIs are up to it. If not, you could always go down to native control renderer and try and set some focus that way. But yeah, you can give a label of focus.
All right, and then let's do one more. What free SDKs or toolkits would you recommend for getting started with accessibility?
So cool. That kind of brings me to my next and last slide, really. So there is an Android testing application. This is only for Android, and it's called Accessibility Scanner. So you can install this, and I haven't used it, and you can add your APK to it, and it will scan your app, trying to tell you things that you need to do to improve your application from an accessibility standpoint. So it's like, hey, these colors are bad, or this text is hidden, or this UI can't be reached, whatever the case may be. So this is a good point for iOS. There's nothing like this for Android. There's nothing like this for iOS, sadly. And so then, and again, like I said, there's just one thing that's missing is like tools and frameworks and stuff. So but you're going to be doing a lot of manual testing, testing keyboards, testing your colors, testing different versions of TalkBack, because every time they update TalkBack, there's new features. But there's not a lot there other than just going through the documentation There's no other special SDKs. One of the things I'm working on, it's a small plug, don't hate me, but I'm working on like an automated testing solution for accessibility. Because we automate Xamarin Test Cloud UI testing and unit tests and other testing. I want to automate that. There's no tools. So I'm trying to build some kind of open source framework that would capture audio, use a speech-to-text engine, recognize it, and kind of give us test scripts for accessibility. No code right there. It doesn't exist yet. I'm in the next couple of weeks, so you should see some code there. But I'm really open to the community and trying to drive that and get some automation around our testing. But otherwise, it's just, it's a little bit of like learn the hard way still. We don't have a great knowledge base on that. When you go to look at your examples on Xamarin website or somewhere else, see if they're accessibility. They're probably not. So then reach out to the people that do those examples and say, hey, could you make this, meet ADA standards of accessibility or something like that. Be vocal about it.
Excellent. So thank you. That sort of brings us to the end of our time. We have a couple of last comments, and these are easy because one says great class, and the other says I'm going to write a Xamarin.Forms plugin that helps check the app for common accessibility issues. So it sounds like people are interested in pursuing this, which is great. It definitely, I have to go back and revisit the UI that I was building this week after listening to this. So I really appreciate this as well. So excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you everyone for attending. That brings us to the end of our time. Everyone have a good day.